Callum Winslow believed he was bringing home a lost dog for just a few days. The Border Collie never barked, never begged for food, and never asked to stay. Every evening, he simply sat by the window, waiting for someone who had not given up looking for him. But the day his true owner finally appeared, neither of them could have imagined that one forgotten leash, a century-old secret hidden inside an archive, and a single honest decision would change all three of their lives forever. This is a story about kindness that asks for nothing in return, about courage to choose what is right over what is profitable, and about how sometimes the road home begins with helping someone who cannot ask for help. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like the video. It really helps the channel and inspires us to bring you more heartfelt stories. By the time the board meeting finally ended, the city had already disappeared beneath a cold autumn rain. Callum Winslow remained alone in the conference room long after everyone else had left. The presentation screens had gone dark, coffee cups sat untouched on the polished table. Outside the glass walls, thousands of office lights shimmered against the wet streets below. 3 hours. That was how long the discussion about the Northern Rail reconstruction project had lasted. Investors demanded faster deadlines. The board wanted lower costs. Consultants argued over numbers as though bridges existed only on spreadsheets instead of carrying real people every day. Callum had approved the revised schedule because there had been no practical alternative. Yet the decision settled heavily somewhere behind his ribs. His assistant stepped into the doorway. "You should go home." He glanced at his watch. Almost 9. "I will," she smiled politely before leaving. She knew he probably would not. For several minutes he stood beside the window, staring at the reflection of his own office instead of the skyline. His life had become strangely efficient. Every hour had a purpose. Every conversation led to another meeting. Every achievement simply created a larger responsibility. People admired him for it. They called him disciplined, focused, reliable. No one ever called him happy. Neither did he. Since his mother had died 3 years earlier, silence had become easier than company. Work asked nothing except competence. People usually asked for much more. Eventually, he collected his coat and headed toward the underground parking garage. The highway leading home passed an abandoned railway crossing where an old steel bridge had been closed for nearly 2 years after structural damage. Temporary barriers blocked the entrance. Warning lights blinked through the rain. Hardly anyone drove this road anymore. Callum almost missed it. At first, he thought it was another construction marker standing beside the guardrail. Then, it moved. A black and white Border Collie sat perfectly still near the entrance to the bridge. The dog was soaked. One front paw barely touched the ground. Its expensive leather collar hung loose, torn nearly in half. Yet nothing about the animal suggested fear or panic. It simply watched every passing car, waiting. Callum slowed almost without thinking. He parked several yards away. The dog remained where it was. No barking, no growling, no desperate attempts to run toward him, only those unusual amber eyes, calm, observant, almost patient. He stepped out into the rain. "Hey." The collie tilted its head slightly. Callum crouched several feet away. "You lost?" The dog looked at him for another long second. Then, with slow, deliberate steps, it walked forward. Instead of asking for food, it lowered something onto the wet pavement, an old leather leash, frayed, covered with mud. The handle was worn smooth by years of someone's hand. The dog gently nudged it closer with its nose, then sat down again. Callum stared. He had seen frightened dogs, hungry dogs, aggressive dogs, never one that seemed to be making a request, not for food, for help. He picked up the leash. The dog did not resist. Instead, it quietly moved beside him, as though the decision had already been made. The veterinarian examined the collie carefully. "A small cut on the paw," she said while cleaning the wound. "Nothing broken." She scanned the collar. "No microchip." Callum frowned. "No owner information?" She shook her head. "The collar's expensive. Well cared for until recently." She smiled while the dog calmly allowed the bandage to be wrapped. "Look at this." She dropped a small biscuit onto the floor. The collie looked at her, then looked at Callum. Only after Callum nodded did it gently take the treat. The veterinarian laughed softly. perfect manners. She looked back at Callum. This dog belongs to someone who spent years training him. So someone is looking. I would almost guarantee it. Callum told himself it would only be for a few days. He posted notices online, called nearby shelters, left his number with veterinary clinics. No one claimed the dog. Meanwhile, the collie quietly settled into a house that had not felt alive for a very long time. The first morning, Callum woke because someone gently nudged his bedroom door. Not scratched, not barked, simply waited. When he finally opened it, the dog looked toward the front entrance. Walk. The routine repeated the next day, and the day after. Callum began leaving the office before sunset instead of long after dark. He noticed trees turning copper along the sidewalks, the smell of rain on old brick buildings, children laughing in parks he had driven past for years without seeing. The silence inside his home slowly changed, not because the dog demanded attention, because it quietly reminded him that time existed outside meetings and deadlines. Yet every evening, precisely after dinner, the collie climbed onto the wide living room windowsill. It remained there, watching the road, watching every passing pair of headlights, sometimes for hours. Callum would stand behind him. You think they are still looking for you. The dog never turned around. Its ears lifted every time another car approached, then lowered again, still waiting. Across the city, another pair of tired eyes searched different streets. Eleanor Iris Hartwell folded another rain-soaked poster before replacing it with a fresh one on the notice board outside a small grocery store. Missing dog, Border Collie. Responds to the name Bryn. She had memorized every telephone number for every animal shelter within 50 miles, every veterinary clinic, every rescue volunteer, 4 days, 4 nights, almost no sleep. Her phone remained silent except for strangers calling with false sightings. She thanked every one of them anyway. By late afternoon, she stood outside another shelter, showing the same photograph once again. The volunteer studied it before gently shaking her head. I am sorry. Eleanor forced herself to smile. Thank you. Back in the street, she pulled her coat tighter against the wind. For a brief second, she closed her eyes, not to cry, only to gather enough strength to visit the next place, then the next, and the next. Somewhere in the city, she believed, he was still waiting. She only hoped he had found someone kind enough to wait with him until she could find the way back. By Saturday morning, the rain had finally given way to pale autumn sunlight. Callum had no meetings, no conference calls, no reports waiting on his desk. Even so, he woke at exactly the same hour his workdays usually demanded. Old habits rarely disappeared simply because the calendar changed. Bryn was already sitting by the front door. The bandage on his paw was gone now. The limp had almost disappeared. When Callum reached for the leash, Bryn did something unusual. He did not rush outside. Instead, he looked at Callum first, as though making sure they were going together. The city park was livelier than usual. Families filled the walking paths, children chased falling leaves. Near the eastern lawn, a local dog training club had gathered for its weekly obedience classes. Dogs of every size waited beside their owners, practicing commands while instructors moved quietly among them. Callum stopped a respectful distance away. Bryn watched the lesson with unusual focus. His ears lifted, his posture changed. For several seconds he stood perfectly still. Then something caught his attention. Without warning, the leash slipped through Callum's fingers. Bryn, the collie, was already running, not wildly, not fearfully, with complete certainty. Callum followed, expecting an apology to whichever stranger had suddenly attracted the dog's attention. Instead, he saw a woman standing near one of the instructors. She wore a light beige coat, her long brown hair loosely braided over one shoulder. She had been listening to the lesson until the sound of running paws made her turn. Everything about her changed in an instant, not dramatically, quietly, as if the entire world had stopped breathing. Bryn, her voice barely carried across the grass. The dog slowed only when he reached her. She did not throw herself at him. She simply lowered herself onto one knee. For one suspended moment, neither of them moved. Then, Bryn stepped forward and rested his head against her shoulder. His eyes closed. So did hers. There were no tears, no desperate cries, only the kind of silence that belonged to two souls who no longer needed words. Around them, conversations faded. Even the barking from the training field seemed strangely distant. Callum stopped several feet away. He had never seen gratitude expressed without movement, yet somehow this was exactly that. When Eleanor finally opened her eyes, she wrapped one arm carefully around Bryn's neck. "I looked everywhere," the dog answered by pressing closer. "I know." She smiled for the first time. It transformed her face completely. The guarded expression Callum had seen from a distance dissolved into something gentle enough to make the previous days of searching visible without a single explanation. An older dog trainer approached slowly. "I wondered if this was your boy." Eleanor nodded. "He always came here to practice." The instructor smiled. He remembered. A nearby bench overlooked the training field. For several minutes, none of them hurried to leave. Callum handed Eleanor the worn leather leash. "I think this belongs to you." She accepted it carefully. Her thumb traced the cracked handle before she quietly nodded. "Thank you." There was another silence. This one felt different, more cautious. Callum finally asked, "How long has he been with you?" 3 years. She looked down at Bryn. "He wasn't always like this." Callum listened. "He came from a rehabilitation center." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "His first owners believed fear was training." The sentence landed softly, almost too softly. He flinched whenever someone raised a hand. He refused to eat if anyone stood nearby. He slept with one eye open. Bryn leaned against her leg as though remembering none of it anymore. "It took nearly a year before he trusted enough to fall asleep beside me." She smiled faintly. "The first time he brought me his favorite toy, I cried after he couldn't see me." Callum glanced toward the collie. "So that's why he's so calm." "No," she shook her head. "He's calm because he finally learned the world doesn't always hurt." The words stayed with him longer than he expected. "I posted notices," Callum said. "Called shelters, veterinary clinics." "I know," she surprised him. "My picture disappeared from 2 notice boards yesterday." He frowned. "I took them down after leaving my phone number with the staff." "You were trying to help." He nodded once, nothing more. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, then her expression quietly changed again. "You own Winslow Infrastructure." It was not a question. "I do." "I recognized you after I got here." Another pause. "I've seen interviews." Callum almost smiled. "They're usually about bridges. They're usually about success." Her voice remained polite, too polite. People who truly trusted each other rarely sounded that careful. "I appreciate what you did." She clipped the leash back onto Bryn's collar. "I really do." "But?" She hesitated only a second. "I've learned that men in expensive suits often enjoy being the hero for a day." The sentence was calm, almost gentle, which somehow made it sharper. "They rescue something." She looked toward Bryn. "They feel good about themselves. And then they return to lives where kindness costs them nothing." Callum did not answer immediately. Part of him wanted to explain, to tell her she was wrong, that nobody had photographed him, nobody even knew he had stopped that night. Instead, he simply looked at Bryn. The collie stood quietly between them, completely unaware of the distance that had suddenly appeared. Callum unclipped the spare leash he had bought earlier that week. "I hope he heals completely." "He will. I believe you." He gave Bryn one last gentle scratch behind the ears. The dog looked up at him, confused, then back at Eleanor. Callum smiled faintly. "You've been waiting for her much longer than you've known me." Without another word, he stepped back. There was something unexpectedly dignified about leaving without demanding to be understood. Eleanor watched him walk away. She had expected annoyance, perhaps wounded pride. Instead, he simply disappeared into the crowd. For reasons she could not explain, that unsettled her more. Life returned to normal, or at least it tried to. Bryn was home again. His favorite blanket waited beside Eleanor's bookshelf. His food bowl returned to its usual place. Everything should have felt complete. Except every afternoon during their walk, Bryn stopped making the familiar turn toward the river. Instead, he pulled gently in another direction, past the bakery, past the old library, toward a quiet neighborhood lined with maple trees. The first time, Eleanor thought he had become distracted. The second time, she laughed softly. The third time, she followed. Eventually, they stopped in front of a modern brick house with large windows overlooking the street. Bryn sat down. His tail brushed the fallen leaves. He stared at the front door, waiting. Eleanor recognized the address almost immediately. She had dropped Bryn's blanket there after collecting his medical records from the veterinarian. She looked down at the dog. "You miss him?" Bryn glanced at her, then back at the house, not pulling, not whining, simply waiting. As though, in his uncomplicated understanding of the world, there was no reason two good people should remain strangers when both had already made room in their lives for the same lonely heart. Monday restored the rhythm both of them had tried, unsuccessfully, to escape. Callum returned to boardrooms. Eleanor returned to dust, parchment, and silence. Neither expected their paths to cross again so soon, yet the city had already begun drawing the lines long before either of them noticed. The redevelopment proposal arrived on Callum's desk shortly before noon. He skimmed the executive summary while answering another email. A new regional administration center, parking facilities, commercial offices, expanded transportation access, everything looked routine, until he reached the site map. His eyes stopped. The outlined construction zone stretched across several aging municipal buildings. Among them stood the Hartwell Historical Archive, a stone structure that had quietly occupied the corner of Ashcroft Square for more than a century. According to the report, preservation costs exceeded its economic value. Demolition was recommended. The board had already voted. Only his final signature remained. One of the directors leaned forward. "It is an old building filled with paper." Another nodded. "The city wants efficiency. The museum can relocate. So can the archives." Someone laughed. "History survives perfectly well in digital form." Callum looked once more at the photographs attached to the proposal. An ordinary building, weathered stone, tall windows, nothing remarkable. And yet, he remembered Eleanor saying she worked in an archive. His pen remained motionless. When was the structural assessment completed? Last month. And the historical review? It changes nothing. Another director slid the folder toward him. "We have investors waiting." The archive smelled faintly of old wood and linen. Eleanor preferred that scent to perfume. Paper carried memory. Memory deserved patience. She was cataloging a collection of engineering correspondence rescued years earlier from flood damage when the museum director entered her office. His expression told her everything before he spoke. "The redevelopment proposal became public this morning." She closed the file. "They're serious." He nodded. "If approved," neither finished the sentence. There was little point. The walls around them contained more than shelves. Every room preserved handwritten journals, bridge calculations, railway surveys, personal letters, restoration drawings, pieces of history that existed nowhere else. Buildings could be rebuilt. Original documents could not. After he left, Eleanor remained alone for several minutes. Then she quietly unlocked a storage cabinet at the back of the conservation room. Inside rested dozens of gray archival boxes. One carried a small handwritten label. Northern Rail Expansion, 1919 to 1924. She hesitated. Something about the project name felt unexpectedly familiar. That evening, Bryn waited at the museum entrance. He had become something of an unofficial employee. Visitors greeted him. Children always stopped to pet him. When Eleanor finally locked the doors, he nudged her hand before beginning their walk home. Halfway through the route, he paused, then gently pulled toward Maple Street, toward the quiet brick house. Eleanor sighed. "You really are stubborn." Bryn simply looked at her. Eventually, she smiled. "Only 5 minutes." The house was dark. No cars stood in the driveway. Bryn sat on the sidewalk anyway, not asking to go inside, simply watching, as though making certain someone else would eventually return safely too. The following afternoon, Eleanor carefully unfolded several oversized engineering drawings inside the restoration room. The paper had yellowed with age. Ink lines remained remarkably clear. Detailed soil surveys, bridge foundations, subsurface water measurements. She compared them with publicly available planning documents for the modern reconstruction project. At first, she expected only historical differences. Engineering standards changed over a century. Measurements became more precise. Materials improved. But one notation refused to leave her mind. She checked another drawing, then another. Finally, she opened the original geological survey attached to the foundation calculations. Her heartbeat slowed. Not quickened. Slowed. The old engineers had documented a deep clay layer beneath the eastern support zone. Modern reports identified compact gravel. Both could not be true. She spent the rest of the afternoon comparing every figure, every elevation, every coordinate. The discrepancy remained. If the original survey was correct and nothing suggested otherwise, the revised design placed long-term pressure directly above unstable soil. Not enough to collapse immediately. That was what made it dangerous. The bridge would stand for years, then settle, slowly, silently. Enough to create structural distortion long after construction crews had disappeared. Eleanor leaned back. She wanted to be wrong. She checked everything again. She was not. Callum received an unexpected phone call just before sunset. It concerns the railway project. He recognized Eleanor's voice immediately. I found something. An hour later, she placed several carefully protected documents across the conference table in his office. Neither mentioned the museum, neither mentioned Bryn, only the papers between them. I restored these after the flood 6 years ago. Callum looked up. Flood? She nodded. The basement was under 2 meters of water. Most people assumed the engineering archives were beyond saving. She smiled faintly. We dried every page by hand. He stared at her. Every page? It took 8 months. There was no pride in her voice. Only fact. She pointed toward the original survey. The foundation calculations in your current proposal rely on incomplete geological data. He frowned. We commissioned new reports. I know. She slid another drawing beside it. But this layer was never rediscovered because later drilling stopped too early. He studied the measurements, the notation, the signatures. Nothing appeared fabricated, nothing exaggerated. Finally, he looked at her. You realize what this means? I do. He waited. She could have asked him to protect the archive, demanded guarantees, negotiated. Instead, she gathered the remaining papers into a neat stack. The museum matters to me. She met his eyes. But people crossing that bridge matter more. Silence settled between them. Then she said quietly, The truth remains the truth, even when it is inconvenient. Callum looked at her for a long time, not because he questioned the documents, because he realized she had just placed integrity above her own interests. Very few people ever did. The emergency board meeting lasted less than 40 minutes. It felt much longer. Callum laid the restored drawings before the directors. I am ordering an independent engineering review. One executive stared at him in disbelief. Based on century-old paperwork? Based on evidence. The contracts are already signed. Then we review them. Another director leaned forward. Do you understand how much this delay will cost? I do. Investors joined by video conference. Voices grew louder. One accused him of surrendering to political pressure. Another suggested he had become emotionally compromised. Someone else called it career suicide. Callum listened without interrupting. When the room finally became quiet, he spoke only once. If there is even a small possibility these calculations are correct, we are not discussing profit. He closed the folder. We are discussing responsibility. No one applauded. No one agreed. By evening, financial media had already begun reporting internal conflict within Winslow Infrastructure. Several board members privately discussed replacing him. For the first time in years, Callum drove home uncertain whether he would still have his position a month later. That same evening, Eleanor sat alone in the archive reading room. Outside, rain tapped gently against the old windows. Inside, Bryn rested at her feet. The phone remained silent. She had no idea what decision Callum had made. She had done what conscience required. Nothing more. Across the city, another house stood equally quiet. Callum unlocked his front door. Before he could remove his coat, Bryn's spare tennis ball rolled gently across the hallway floor. He smiled despite himself. He had forgotten it was still there. Without thinking, he picked it up. At almost the same moment, miles away, Bryn lifted his head as though sensing a familiar thought. Neither Callum nor Eleanor knew what the coming weeks would cost them. But the dog who had once waited alone beside an abandoned bridge had somehow become the invisible thread connecting two people who were beginning to understand that trust was never built through grand declarations. It was built one honest decision at a time. The independent review lasted 6 weeks. It examined every calculation, every soil sample, every archived survey. Engineers from 3 separate firms repeated the analysis without knowing why the original drawings had suddenly become so important. Their conclusions arrived on a quiet Thursday morning. The forgotten geological layer was real. The original survey from a century earlier had been accurate. The modern drilling program had stopped several meters too soon. The foundation design would not have failed immediately. That was precisely the danger. The bridge would have appeared perfect. Until years later, when slow settlement beneath one section could have weakened the entire eastern approach. The redesign cost millions. Construction paused. Contracts were rewritten. Several investors withdrew. The financial press called it one of the company's most expensive delays. Inside the company, opinions were divided. Some directors never forgave Callum. One resigned. Another openly claimed he had sacrificed profits to protect his public image. Callum answered none of them. Numbers eventually recovered. Lives could not. Months later, one of the senior engineers approached him after a meeting. "I was angry with you." Callum nodded. "I know." The older man smiled faintly. "I was wrong." It was a short conversation. Yet somehow it meant more than every award Callum had ever accepted. Respect earned after disappointment always carried more weight than admiration given too easily. The city council quietly announced another decision. The historical archive would remain. Instead of demolition, the restoration project received a preservation grant supported jointly by the municipality and several engineering organizations. One newspaper described it as an unusual partnership between history and modern infrastructure. Eleanor smiled when she read the article. Not because the museum had been saved, although that alone would have been enough. She smiled because nowhere in the article did Callum's name appear. He had not organized interviews. He had not stood before cameras. He had simply done what needed to be done. For weeks she had believed his silence came from pride. Now she understood something different. Some people did not announce their principles. They simply lived by them. Looking back, she realized he had never once reminded her that he had found Bryn, never mentioned the documents she had given him, never asked for gratitude. She had mistaken restraint for distance and success for vanity. The mistake humbled her more than she expected. Autumn slowly became winter. Winter gave way to spring. One bright afternoon, the museum receptionist appeared in the restoration room. "You have a visitor." Eleanor removed her gloves and stepped into the entrance hall. Callum stood there holding a small flat envelope. No briefcase, no tailored overcoat, only a simple navy sweater and a look that seemed almost uncertain. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "You aren't," he smiled. "I came as a customer." From the envelope, he carefully removed an old black and white photograph. Its edges were torn. A crease crossed the center. The image itself had faded almost beyond recognition. "My mother." Eleanor held it carefully beneath the light. "You've kept this a long time." "It stayed in her wallet." He hesitated. "I found it after she passed away." There were easier places to restore an old photograph, faster places, cheaper places. He had come here anyway. "I'd be honored." The restoration took several visits, then several more. Sometimes they spoke about photographs, sometimes about engineering, sometimes about nothing important at all. For the first time in years, Callum discovered conversations that did not need an agenda. Eleanor discovered that trust rarely arrived as one dramatic moment. More often, it appeared quietly, one ordinary afternoon after another. When the restored photograph was finally finished, they left the museum together. Bryn waited patiently outside the entrance, tail brushing lazily against the stone steps. He greeted them both with exactly the same quiet happiness. No excitement, no hesitation, only certainty. They walked toward the river as evening settled over the city. The promenade shimmered beneath rows of old lanterns. Boats drifted slowly with the current. Neither hurried. For a while they watched people pass, Children riding bicycles, an elderly couple sharing roasted chestnuts, street musicians packing away their instruments, life moving gently around them. "You know," Eleanor said softly, "I used to believe kindness was usually an investment." Callum looked toward the water. "And now?" "I think sometimes it is simply a habit." He smiled. "I wasn't always kind." "No," she laughed quietly. "You were mostly tired. I probably still am. Less than before." He could not argue with that. Bryn walked peacefully between them, not pulling toward one person, not choosing. His place had become exactly where he was, between two people who no longer felt quite so alone. Halfway across the promenade, their hands brushed by accident. Neither pulled away. Some gestures did not need discussion. 1 year later, the rebuilt railway bridge opened to the public. The ceremony was surprisingly ordinary. No oversized banners, no dramatic speeches, no orchestra. Workers stood beside architects. Engineers greeted maintenance crews by name. Families crossed the bridge simply because it was now part of their daily route. That was always the real purpose, not headlines, people. Callum stood near the railing watching the first train roll safely across the new structure. The redesigned foundations lay hidden beneath the earth, invisible, exactly as good foundations should be. Eleanor slipped her hand into his. Neither spoke for several moments. On the grassy bank nearby, Bryn rested comfortably beneath the afternoon sun, occasionally lifting his head to watch children playing nearby before settling down again. Peace looked remarkably ordinary. Callum smiled. "Funny." He glanced toward Bryn. "I thought I had simply taken home a stray dog one evening." Eleanor followed his gaze. Then she looked back at him. "No." Her voice carried the quiet certainty of someone who no longer feared being wrong. "He simply found the right road for each of us." They stood there as another train crossed safely overhead. Hundreds of strangers passed without knowing how close they had once come to walking across a bridge built upon a forgotten mistake. Perhaps that was the greatest success of all. The best decisions rarely announced themselves. They became invisible parts of other people's ordinary lives. Home, Callum finally understood, was never a particular house. It was the place where responsibility became love without anyone noticing exactly when the change had happened. Sometimes it began with protecting a bridge, sometimes with preserving a forgotten photograph, sometimes with choosing the truth when it offered nothing in return. And sometimes, on an ordinary rainy evening, it began with a tired man stopping his car for a lonely dog who was not looking for a new owner. He was simply waiting for the people who still had to find one another.